And so we're going to start off the session by looking broadly at what is the purpose of assessment. And Karalyn's going to explain a bit why we've decided to take this approach. And we asked you to grab something to write with, because we're going to be using like a tool, a learning and teaching tool called what happened there? Called a KWL chart, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then we're going to start introducing some terms, including formative and summative assessments, learning outcomes, assessment alignment. We're going to talk a bit about providing feedback, and then we're going to come back to the KWL charts that we've asked you to work on during the session, and explain a little bit more about why we decided to do that. And then we're going to end our session with a Q&A segment. And what I will say is that the way that Karalyn and I sort of structured this session is for us to give you information at the forefront, and then to wait until we're towards the end of the session to open it up to Q&A. And the reason why is because we want to give you things to sort of think about and sit with before you start asking your questions, so that we can have a really rich discussion. So that's our roadmap. And I'll throw it back to Karalyn now.
Thanks. So as we start to talk about assessment, I know that everyone in the room probably has some kind of differing level of comfort with the word assessment and maybe what that means from a curriculum point of view and from a teaching and learning point of view. But the common ground we all, I think, come with is that, we've all been learners or are currently learners and have our own experiences around assessment. And what we're going to talk about today is really about how assessment practices are activities that help us to determine if students have achieved the learning goals that we set out for them. And why to talk about assessment? Well, learning is often kind of invisible, and it happens within a student, and it happens potentially outside of the classroom. And so we need concrete strategies of how are we going to create these assessment activities, and why are we going to make the decisions we do in terms of what an assessment looks like and when it is implemented in a course, and how students engage with the assessment. And realistically, a lot of the decisions that we make around assessment impact how students navigate through our courses and how they choose to learn and engage with different materials. So it's really important for us to talk about assessment in all of the different roles that we might have at a university. So whether you're a teaching assistant, whether you are a teaching fellow or teaching your own courses right now, we all can have a really important role to play in how assessment plays out in the classroom. I think it's important to note too, we're going to talk about assessment today. We're not going to really focus on grading, because we're really focusing on the learning piece and how assessment is used as a tool for learning and to examine our students' learning, not really necessarily making that connection about how different forms of assessment connect into a grade book. So today's focus of the workshop is really going to talk about like principles of assessment. And we're trying to set this foundation about what assessment means in your course and what kind of decisions you're going to make around designing your own assessments. But it means we can't talk about everything in a really deep dive detail. We won't be talking about all of the kind of specifics of assessment, and we won't be talking about all of the different ways assessment can be enacted in a course. That's just too big of a scope. So what we're really doing is trying to focus in on that foundations piece to help you build your own conceptualization of what assessment will look like within your own context. And like Clarissa said, we're going to keep questions hopefully to the end. We don't want them to get lost in the chat. So please take note of any questions you have throughout, and we'll make sure that we have lots of time towards the end for discussion.
Thanks, Karalyn. So now we're getting to that KWL chart that I mentioned during the roadmap. And so on the piece of paper that you grabbed, I want you to make a chart. And if you don't have a piece of paper, you can also do this on your device, but I would make sure that it's somewhere where it's easy for you to go in and take notes while also, being able to pop in to the Zoom presentation. And that is because you're using the KWL chart to take notes throughout the session. So what is a KWL chart? So KWL stands for what I know, K, what I want to know, W, and what I've learned. And so in a minute, I'm going to ask you to fill out the first two columns of your chart, which is what do you know about assessment and what do you want to know about assessment? And I really encourage you not to think about this, in too formal of a way. This is going to be a learning tool for you, so you can be as informal, as casual as you want to. You can do bullet points, you can have incomplete thoughts. That is all up to you and according to what you find most helpful. But I did want to give you all a few minutes to fill in those first two columns. So what do you know about assessment and what do you want to know? And then in a minute, I will explain a little bit more about what we're going to do on that third column. And I know that sometimes silence is kind of uncomfortable. So I pulled up like a chill playlist, and I will let you know when we're going to transition back into the presentation. So I didn't plan this, but that song ended up being perfect for this activity because it was exactly 3.5 minutes long. And for those of you who are interested, that song is called Khaleesi by Misha and Kuka Bona. It's just something I found on Spotify under Chill Hop instrumental. But thank you for filling out your first two columns. And I'm looking forward to talking more about the stuff that came out in those two columns. But now I'm going to explain a little bit about how we're going to be using this KWL chart through the duration of this workshop. And so now you have the first two columns filled. And what I'm going to ask you to focus on as we are talking, as Karalyn and I are explaining more about the foundational pieces of assessment that we're focusing in on, is this what I've learned column. And so the reason why I've asked you to either keep your chart on a piece of paper or somewhere easy where you can flip back and forth between the Zoom presentation and your notes is because I'd like for you to, as we're talking, to jot down things that you didn't know about assessment and that you're learning, just to keep a record of things that are coming out to you as important or super interesting, and things that you didn't already know about assessment. And then we're going to come back to it, like I said, at the end of the session. So as Karalyn mentioned, we are going to be talking about specific certain foundational pieces of assessment in response to this question of what is the purpose of assessment. And the first two concepts I kind of want to introduce to this group. When we're trying to distill or figure out what's the purpose of assessment in my course, one of the first things that you can ask yourself is what kind of assessment I'm doing. And that doesn't necessarily mean what's the activity, what's the thing that I'm going to grade. It's the what kind of assessment in terms of what am I trying to get out of the assessment. And so to sort of unpack that, we are going to introduce the terms formative and summative assessments to you. And I'll start with formative. So formative assessments are kind of like check-ins that students and instructors use to see where students are in their learning, what their needs are, or what sort of areas of growth they are needed for in their learning journey. Excuse me. Sometimes I stumble over my words. And formative assessments, because they give us that check-in on where students are in their learning, it's also really helpful for us to give feedback to students to guide their learning and to sort of identify the next steps that they need to do to achieve learning outcomes, which is something Karalyn's going to talk about a little later on. And so because formative assessment gives us this really important information about where students are in their learning and where they need to go, there's a bunch of different ways that both instructors and students can use formative assessments as sort of like evidence or guidance on their learning. So some of the ways that instructors can use formative assessments is to plan for future content, to adjust their teaching practices, learning activities, and evaluations, and to create alternative learning plans. And this could be for an individual who may be in a place where you need to address specific needs, or it could be class-wide when you notice that in general, your class needs revision on specific types or themes or content in your course. And then, formative assessment, and something we're going to sort of encourage you to think about or shift your thinking towards, is that assessment is not just for instructors. Assessment is a really important learning tool for students as well. And so the ways that students can use formative assessments include understanding what they do and don't understand from the course, and then for them to also identify what are my areas of need are, like, where can I, like, what do I need to ask for support in? And so I would really encourage us to also think about assessment as maybe even a sort of empowerment for students, because it gets them to really think about, okay, who am I as a learner? Where am I as in my learning? And what do I need to do to accomplish what I need to do in my learning? And in a couple of slides, I'll give you some actual concrete examples of formative assessment so that you know what that kind of could look like in your classroom. So formative assessment, that's the first kind of term that I want to introduce you to. And then summative assessments are sort of like what we more so, or traditionally we would imagine when it comes to things like assessments, which is a measurement of student learning. And so I pulled up this grading scale, like the Queen's GPA grading scale, because those are the measurements that we most sort of think about when it comes to assessments, that we mark student work, we give them a grade, that grade goes towards a final grade. And instructors use summative assessments basically to record where students are in their learning, and then communicate with them what from that course that they learned. But something I want to again shift our thinking towards is, summative assessments can also be formative assessments. So if the purpose of formative assessments is to give feedback and to direct future learning, there are ways that we could use summative assessments for those formative purposes. And what's more so important is to think about what information am I getting from the assessment that I'm implementing, and how can it be used for very specific purposes. So there are going to be times in your course where an assessment is just summative, and it's just going to go towards recording student learning. And that's not a bad thing. That's a really important part of how we do education, institutionally. But that's not the only way that you can use summative assessments. You can also use it as a means of communication with your students, to tell them where they are in their learning, and to also tell yourself where they are in their learning, and perhaps also use that information to make decisions, and then also to debrief with students. And yeah, so it's a piece where you can sort of start making adjustments as an instructor. So those are two terms that we're going to introduce you to. And so as a quick revision, formative is about checking in with student learning and making plans accordingly, and getting students to understand where they are in their learning. And summative is largely used to record grades and contribute to final grades, but can also be used for formative purposes. And so, a lot of the time when people talk about formative and summative assessment, sometimes the demarcation that's made is that formative assessment happens, throughout the course, while we're giving lectures, while we're doing tutorials, and while we're doing labs. And then summative happens at the end as the end result. And instead of thinking of formative and assessment in terms of when they happen, I want you to, or I would encourage you to think about instead, what is the purpose of this assessment? So not when it happens, but why it happens, and for what purpose, and what you're going to use it as an instructor for, and what you would like students to use it as. And so, again, I'd really want to impress this point about how formative and summative assessments can also overlap and be both. So I'm going to take a minute to pause here, and for you to do a quick check-in on your own learning and sort of quiz yourself on whether you think one of these examples are formative, summative, or both. And this is something that you can do on your own to check in on your learning. If you want, you can share an answer in the chat. You are not obligated to. And as I go through the examples, I'll explain why. I'll, reveal the answer. I'm doing lots of air quotes. It's so obnoxious. I don't know. I just need something to do in my hand sometimes. I'll sort of share the answer of what the example is, and then I'll debrief what it is. So the first example is an exit card. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term exit card, it's something that the students submit back before they're allowed to sort of exit the classroom. So it's usually, it can be done at the end of tutorials, at the end of labs, at the end of a course where a student usually answers a question, and then as a ticket, they can leave. And so the exit card in this scenario is one that's submitted to the TA at the end of a lab session, answering a question about the procedures covered in the lab, but does not contribute to the final grade. So is this formative, summative, or both? And I'll give you a couple seconds to answer that for yourself. We have one contribution in the chat. Thank you, Sean. I didn't know that people could share on my screen. After 2 years of using Zoom, I'm realizing that people can add to shared screens and do their own demarcation. So I think that was Lauren. Thank you, Lauren. But sorry. So it is a formative assessment. And the reason why it is a formative assessment is, not just because it doesn't count for grades. Sorry, my screen's doing a funny thing. Not just because it doesn't count for grades, and formative assessments usually are more so just for collecting information, but also because it checks in with student learning. What from this lab session did students take away? What did they get? What are they on the ball with? What maybe did they miss? And then a TA can use that to decide future labs, how they teach in future labs. So this is an example of a formative assessment. Oops, I gave away the answer. Oh no. So the next example is a final exam, which is written after the course lectures have ended. So is this formative, summative, or both? You can quiz yourself. I'll give you a few seconds. Thank you, Laura. Laura is sharing their answer with the class, which you're, again, welcome to in the chat as well. All right, so the final exam written after the course is a summative assessment. And the reason why it's a summative assessment is because there is no chance to debrief then. There is no chance to check in with student learning for the purposes of adjusting your teaching practices. And there's no chance for students to sort of adjust their learning to then find out, figure out what they need to do for the rest of the course, or where they need support in for the rest of the course. And so this is an example of an assessment that's just for the purpose of recording grades and contributing to that final grade. All right, so the next question is a term paper, which is submitted at the end of the fall semester. And then after that term paper is submitted, the instructor moves on to new concepts or new topics in the winter semester. So is this formative, summative, or both? So Laura's making a great point in the chat. I'm gonna share it with the room. Usually summative, but it really depends on the feedback given and if it does help with writing skills. I would say, and Sean, thank you. I would say both, but summative for the prof, formative, and summative for the learner. Wow, that's a great point. All right, so for what I have categorized this as summative. And I think that some contextualizing here is important, as has already been revealed in the chat. And it is because of how it's used. And so in this scenario, what the scenario I painted in my mind is that the instructor moves on to new concepts and topics and doesn't give this a chance for students to sort of adjust their learn, or not students, doesn't give the instructor the opportunity to revisit the concepts in the fall semester, or give students the chance to then have their learning sort of built upon based on those concepts. So in my brain, and I'll give a further example of where I took this example from. So during the first year of my undergrad, I took an anthropology course, Anthro 101, and it was taught by 4 different instructors that split up the entire year-long course into like 4 quadrants. And so each time that they moved on to new concepts, they moved on to a new instructor, and there was no opportunity then to go back and say, what didn't I learn about these concepts from this quadrant? And then, build my understanding there. And because the topics were so kind of drastic, like we did like cultural anthropology, like linguistic anthropology, and then 2 others that I've forgotten because it was like 15 years ago, there was no chance for the instructor to check in with my learning. And there wasn't even a chance for me to check in with my learning because the course didn't necessarily build on concepts. And so I think that contextualizing information was really important for me to provide, and that Laura and Sean are both correct in how they were understanding. And I once again go back to what both of them made a point of saying, is that it's really how it's used. And so if a student is using it to build their own learning and to understand what they need to develop, that is both formative and summative. And it really, and if that information then is used by students, again, for other things like their writing, to decide what do I need to work on with their writing, it can be formative. So wonderful points made in the chat. Thank you so much. And then the last example is an essay, which is worth 20% of the final grade, but a TA chooses to use it to determine concepts that need to be reviewed. So is this formative, summative, or both? So I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing Karalyn needs time for her sections of the workshop. But this is an example where it's both, because yes, this assignment goes to 20% of the grade, but what's the really important piece here is that a TA chooses to, review what the class or the tutorial section needs to revisit, or, what can they move on from, because the class is showing that they're already understanding certain concepts. So again, it comes back to this idea of how is this assessment being used? And so it is being used to record grades, but it's also being used by a TA to gather information about what needs to happen in the subsequent tutorial sections. So, thank you all for quizzing yourselves and participating. We'll loop back to some of these ideas towards the end during the discussion. So Karalyn, thank you for being patient with me.
No, not at all. So I'm just thinking as we discussed that we're kind of diving a little bit deeper into all of these pieces of assessment, but I'm actually going to take the sidestep and let's talk about learning outcomes for just a few minutes, because learning outcomes, although we could have an entire hour workshop on learning outcomes as their own topic, are intricately intertwined with our conversation around assessment today. And so it's important for us to understand what learning outcomes are. And then in our next few slides, we'll talk about how that relationship between learning outcomes and assessment looks like. So I've pulled this definition of learning outcomes from a handbook that we have at the CTL, because I think it does a pretty good job at describing that learning outcomes are these direct statements that describe the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind that students are expected to reliably demonstrate after a learning experience. So it's really what do we want students to know and be able to do at the end of our module, at the end of our course, or at the end of our kind of learning experience. And when we see learning outcomes written, they often have these kind of 3 integral pieces to them. The first is a STEM, where it's something along the lines of, as a result of engaging in this course or this activity or this lab, your students will be able to, so it's setting them up. So at the end of this course, students are going to be able to, and then the second part is some sort of action verb. So it's what are students going to be able to do? And the verb that you pick really identifies the type and the depth of learning that we expect. And then finally, the what. And this is mostly disciplinary context. It could be the actual what we have students doing or learning. And it could also specify how they're going to demonstrate that. So really how your learning outcome is structured can be as intricate and as detailed as you make them. But these are the 3 key pieces that they should have. And most often you're going to find learning outcomes articulated in the syllabus. They are not always there, but every Queen's course has learning outcomes associated with it. So they're there, they're written. You just sometimes have to ask to figure out what they are if they're not explicitly in a syllabus. So a sample, Clarissa, I'll get you to go to the next slide if you don't mind. So if we take a look at a sample learning outcome, and we'll see the three parts in this particular learning outcome. So it starts with a stem of, by the end of this course, students will be able to successfully, and then here's our action verb, apply, and then the context. Bayesian principle probability, to draw valid conclusions from large complex data sets. So this example comes from either a math or statistics discipline. And the key pieces of if we break down this learning outcome is we don't want students to just kind of recall or memorize something. In this case, they're going to apply something. So that's going to tie into our assessment when we talk about the linkage here to our assessment. And then there's the context of what are they doing? So in this case, they're applying some sort of principle of probability, and they're going to do so with a large data set. So your learning outcome is detailed enough to give some idea of exactly what we expect students to be able to do at the end of our course. So why discuss learning outcomes today in an assessment workshop? Clarissa, I'll get you to pop to the next slide. And we're going to talk about how these are interrelated, how your assessment and learning outcomes are always linked or should be linked. And in this section, we could have brought in a number of different ways to describe, how our curriculum is designed to link these concepts together. But we've chosen to describe something called backward design. And backward design comes out of a book that was written originally in 1998 by Wiggins and McRae. And it really has this approach that they compare similar to other kind of professional disciplines that take this design approach of knowing what your end goal is and then designing towards your end goal. And what they've done is they've described it in terms of our curriculum and in terms of how we design our courses. And it's broken down into kind of 3 steps. So the first step is really identifying your desired results. And in this case, it's our course learning outcomes. So we first have to know, what do we expect students to know and learn and do at the end of our course? The second piece of this is, and this is the one in the kind of red box because it relates to what we're talking about today, is determining our acceptable evidence of learning and planning our assessments. So on the one hand, we have this idea of exactly what we want students to learn. The next key piece is how are they going to demonstrate that learning back to us? And this comes back to the fact that our learning can often be invisible and we don't see it every single day. We don't see it in the classroom necessarily, but we need to have assessments and this idea of what do we want students to show us to tell us that they've met those learning goals. And when we talk about evidence, the word evidence can sometimes be scary, and it's not a grade. It's not always one particular thing at the end of the course. The evidence is all of the different things, both formative and summative, that happen throughout the course and at the end of the course that collectively come together to show us that students have met that learning goal. And then the last piece is, once you have your learning outcomes, your assessment ideas, now's the time that you go back and now you plan the learning experiences and instruction. So you have the start, the end, and then the last piece is the connection between the two. And this is a really important point because now we talk about, well, how do we prepare students to be successful on our assessments? And how do we set them up so that the assessment is authentic and is something that contributes to their learning? So an example here is if one of our course learning outcomes is about getting students to compare some concepts or critique some concepts. And I think my final activity or one of my assessments should be an essay for them to do that. Some of my learning activities throughout the term may be really setting students up to be able to do that. I might have a smaller ungraded assignment looking at creating a thesis statement. And then maybe I have a smaller assessment on how do students critique a paper. And then, these assessments are essentially building in to that final assessment that I want them to do to show me the learning. So there's lots that goes into this kind of design, and assessment is such a key piece of using backwards design. And then the last piece in my part to talk about here is we've talked about, okay, we need some sort of learning outcomes. Then we need to figure out what kind of assessments, formative, summative, what they look like, what are some examples that could happen. And then a key part here is also, especially in formative assessments, we need feedback. Students will need feedback, and we as instructors need feedback in order to kind of facilitate learning. And so one of the things is about, we're bringing in another term here, is about scaffolding our assignments and our feedback. And the example that I just gave of having different types of kind of smaller assignments throughout a term that build up the skills that students need for kind of a bigger final assignment, that's an example of scaffolding. And you would be giving students feedback on all of these little assignments throughout the term that help them to grow and develop into the expectation of what we have for this kind of final piece. And it doesn't always have to build to a final piece. We can have assignments that scaffold within a course and in other areas. We can also have scaffolding between courses, which would be much more complicated, but scaffolding is just kind of building on skills and building on concepts and topics and feedback that we have. And then I think I posed on the slide, I posed a lot of questions because we can talk about what providing students written feedback on their work means, but I think it was important for me instead here to ask you some questions to prompt you to think about what do you include in the feedback that you give to students? And especially as TAs or teaching fellows, we're often in a position of writing constructive feedback on student work. So my questions for you to consider are, how does the constructive feedback that you give to students focus on the learning outcomes for the course? So if you're giving students feedback on this particular assignment, understanding what learning outcome was linked to that assignment and how that alignment works is important, that we can structure our feedback so that students understand their area of growth related to the learning outcome that we're assessing them on. So making sure our feedback aligns. And my second question is, how does your feedback inform what students can do differently to achieve success? Oh, and it says access, success, access, achieve. But really it's about what are we including to tell students, this is something you've done really well, and I'm going to tell you exactly what you did well instead of just saying good job. And what is something that you might consider trying differently or working on in a new way to in the next assignment or in the next activity, to really hone in on the specifics of what do students need to do to achieve our learning outcome and our expectation. So understanding then kind of those specific pieces of feedback. And then my takeaway question, this is for you to think about as you leave the workshop today, is where might you be providing student feedback in your role as a TA or teaching fellow? And how does this relate to your current position?
So now I'm going to have you revisit your KWL chart. And I want you to read through the third column that I asked you to take notes in of the what I've learned. So what did you learn in the short amount of time that Karalyn and I spent talking to you? And I want you to think about, when you look back and compare what you learned to the other two columns, did you build on any knowledge that you already knew? So under your what do I know column, is there anything that you already were sort of familiar on, but now you have more familiarity on, or it just extended your understanding of it? And then I also want to compare that third column to the second column, which is what do I want to know? And I want to see, did anything that you learned today answer any of the questions you had about assessment. And the reason why we decided to use this learning tool for this workshop is because it is an example of formative assessment. We had you check in with what you know, what you want to know, and now you are by doing that, you've sort of identified, okay, so where is my learning? Where do I want my learning to go? And then in your third column, in comparing it to the information to your other two columns, we're checking in on, okay, so what do I know now? And what do I still want to know? What questions weren't necessarily answered by this workshop? And so what are the next steps for me? And then the third sort of part that I didn't mention in this slide, and I'm just going to check real quick if I mentioned it in the next slide. I did not, is, the reason why we chose the approach that we chose for today is because we acknowledge that we cannot answer very, very specific questions about assessment, given the diversity of ways that assessment can look like across many, many disciplines, within specific courses within a discipline, and then further within a certain group of learners. And so what we are hoping is that by giving you the information that we did today, you can start answering, the questions that you had. But then even further than that, if the questions you had weren't answered, what from the information that we provided you today takes you a step forward for where you can find those answers then. So what about formative, summative assessment, learning outcomes, and assessment alignment and feedback? What information can you sort of distill from those pieces to help you unpack the further questions you need to ask, that take you a little bit closer to answering that question? So for example, if one of your questions is, how can I incorporate assessment into critical inquiry in like a social science course? Maybe learning a bit more about formative and summative assessments can help you answer, well, I want this assessment to be formative. Okay, so what does that look like according to what I know now about learning outcomes? And what does that mean according to the kind of feedback that I'm hoping to give students? And then you can start building and unpacking and answering your own question based on the knowledge that you now have because of this workshop.